I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
How? How do you manage every time to pick open a wound to a fresher hell?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My IQ is the highest among all Reddit.
That's not saying much.
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
There's something beyond the direct physical observable world. You can't quantify, you can't put under a microscope. If you don't want to, immediately adopt the Muslim understanding of that, that's fine. You'll get there eventually.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
It's not just witchcraft, it's nerds. You guys are nerds. My parents didn't let me read Harry Potter, not because of the demonic elements. They just didn't want me to be a nerd.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
I've always deemed myself an evil capitalist.
Because that's how they get you. They get in your head. They start making you ask funny questions. And before you know it, bang, you're a liberal.
I thought it was a matter of record.
Social credit deducted.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This week we are joined by Matt Whitman. He is the host of the 10-Minute Bible Hour on YouTube. How's it going today?
Things are great. Thanks for having me, Tyler.
Sure, it's good to hear from you. So, you have, I guess just to kind of introduce, to jump in, for people who don't know who you are, how do you usually introduce your channel and what you do?
Oh man, that's an adventure. I think of what I do as being an educational program on the internet, as opposed to a persuasive or apologetics religious program. I got a background in history and philosophy, as well as theology, biblical studies, stuff like that. So I like to make funny to lightly funny material about the Bible, Christianity, church history, history in general, things like that, in a way that'll make sense to normal people, but that gets us deep into the deep water. And then generally speaking, the tone of my material on the internet is you're smart, you do with it whatever you need to, and we'll probably be able to still get along even if we don't see it all the same way.
It is quite a refreshing approach. In my personal life, I'm so used to having to deal with interpersonal, non-ecumenical disagreements that I appreciate every chance I can get to hear different people from different faiths sitting down and talking rationally and calmly and just saying what they believe and what's important to them. And it's so different than when you hang out with, I don't know if you have groups of people that are just, the Calvinist friends or the Orthodox friends or the Catholic friends, but when you're around them, you get the full experience, and it's usually it can be aggressive if they're of the more aggressive lot.
Well, and isn't that interesting? Every group has their own style and their own DNA. So I was kind of inspecific in answering your question, but for the benefit of the people who are sitting in our conversation here, who I've never met before, I also make a bunch of content on the internet where I go around to other people's churches that are not from my own tradition and try to mostly keep my mouth shut and just ask them what they do and why they do it and what does that sign mean and how come you got your stage laid out like this and what does this thing do and what is your worship service like. And of course when I'm doing that, I want to get after some of those points and be like, all right, let's just get all the way down the rabbit hole. I want to know why and what do you do with this passage and that passage, the typical dance steps. But for the most part, I've managed to restrain myself and just lean into the part of the conversation that is me wanting to learn about somebody else's thing. And then I go and put that on the internet, and I get a totally different audience for every one of those videos, because half of the audience, when I put up a video about, say, Adventism, are Adventists who would never, ever, ever watch any of my other material, but they want to know what some outsider thinks about their thing. And you get a sense real quick with each of these groups as to what the different archetypes of internet personalities that go with it are. You learn what the gracious group looks like, what their dance steps are. You learn what the behavioral fundamentalists in each group are very excited about. You learn what the political fundamentalists in each group are very excited about. And then you learn what the ideological, theological, fundamentalist is too harsh a word. That's pejorative. That's too mean.
I would use the word fundamentalist in a non-pejorative way, just because it does describe a certain category of thought.
Fair enough.
and if you, I've met fundamentalists who self-identify because they're like, well, why wouldn't you be a fundamentalist? Don't you want to believe, like, the purest version of the thing, the full version of the thing? And I'm like, well, it's hard logic to argue with, but.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that it is.
At least it was when I was
about anything.
When I was a fundamentalist, it was hard logic to argue with, but now I'm not. So go figure.
What brand of fundamentalist were you?
I grew up in a non-denominational / Baptist household, which nowadays those are just the same thing. But it kind of had that very classical Bible Belt Christian education. So not a terribly I don't want to say it's uncomplicated, but it got all the features that come with that very specific strain of Christianity.
Okay. Well, like which parts of it were the fundamentalist side, and which parts of it do you think were transcendent representation of larger Christianity?
Oh man, that's a question I'm still trying to work out now.
Fair enough.
For my context, I'm currently attending an Anglican church, and I'm not of the sort I'm not the kind of person that bounces off the Baptist church and immediately winds up in liturgy just because they think everything that behind them was heretical and stupid. I got to a point where I needed something that was a little more academic in my theology, and I wasn't getting it at a lot of the Southern Baptist churches in Tennessee, which is, I don't consider that a spite, because so much of their work is just life application based and daily worship, daily Bible study stuff, which is perfectly fine for 90% of people, but it was something I was just kind of felt a little bit chafed by. I haven't exactly put a word to exactly where I think the divine and the non-divine kind of fits into those churches, because I think the Spirit does flow through churches that my Catholic and Anglican friends would consider the low church, which is why I don't like to just say every Baptist is heretical. I would never go that far or anything. So
oh my goodness, certainly not.
I know some Catholics and Orthodox who it's like there's nothing redeemable about the Baptists at all. I'm like, no, you haven't been around them enough if you think that. But
yeah, they're an easy whipping boy, but on paper, even though I'm not a Baptist, and even though it probably wouldn't be the church context in which I would be most comfortable at this point, on paper, a Baptist statement of faith, it's pretty boring in that it's just sort of historical Trinitarian orthodoxy, but as you would expect, they have a low view of the role of the church in mediating salvation, a high view of grace in their soteriology. Salvation produces good works in Christ, whereas, I always feel like I'm insulting the Catholics when I say this, but so many have said it to me in an official capacity, whereas for the Catholics, the formula is a little bit different, that somehow those good works go hand in hand with a salvation that is mediated by the church. And so, I would expect the Baptist statement of faith to differ there, and it does, but yeah, it seems like it's more in the lived experience and some of that non-denominational 20th century 90s apologetics style of Christianity, where maybe people are feeling more of the rub. It really does feel like there were some things that were built to be very effective when people came home from World War II in articulating, like, okay, 2 out of 3 generations had this massive encounter with life, death, human depravity, God facing down the big questions coming out of World War I, the Depression, and World War II. And so mid-20th century, like, all we need here is just a simple structure at the most basic level to explain rightness with God, because everybody's already thinking about that and seeking it. Well, then the world gets... it changes a lot through the second half of the 20th century, and even more dramatically in the first 20 plus years of the 21st century. And I think the ethos, the ethic of that style of church maybe just isn't built quite as well to scratch the itch and answer the questions or understand the questions that people are grappling with right now. So I find myself a little more able to be patient and forgiving with those kind of legacy evangelical churches, because they did something that a lot of churches that are hopping right now have never done. That is, they cracked the nut once. They figured out what it looked like to say the gospel in a way that made sense and was biblically consistent in a moment in time. You know, if they figured it out once, maybe they figured it out again, but this is kind of why I'm one of those, hey, we really do need each other, and no singular expression of church seems to be great at everything. They've all got their limitations, and some of the limitations maybe grate on me a little bit more than other limitations, but everybody also seems to bring something to the table. So I don't know. This process of going to all these different churches and having all these different conversations, it has definitely messed with me, and I hope good ways, but it's definitely messed with me.
I'm curious, what is your actual background, your faith background? Has it changed since you've grown up, or is it you've been part of the same tradition your entire life?
Yeah, when I was a little kid, Dad was an American Baptist pastor, which is more of a mainline Baptist denomination for people who can't, who haven't put in the time to sort through all the gajillion different expressions of Baptist. It's not like ELCA or United Methodist mainline, but of the Baptist denominations is probably the most that way. Dad felt friction there, and went and planted some churches, ended up kind of falling in with an Evangelical Free Church of America crowd, and then I went to Trinity College in Chicago, which was Evangelical Free Church. I mean, I didn't really know what that meant or anything. I just went to play baseball. And then when I gradually got roped into doing church things, which was never my intent, for whatever reason, I ended up at an Evangelical Free Church. I didn't really solicit that. It just kind of landed in my lap. And so then when I went back to grad school, to seminary, I went to Trinity Divinity School again in Chicago. And so I would say EFCA, Evangelical Free Church of America, kind of a free, American Free Lutheran. That's kind of where that fits. I'd say that's my background. EFCA is rich, thick, creamy, historical evangelical orthodoxy. It doesn't have that one extra point in its statement that is kind of the weird outlier or fight. How all those statements, they've got one point that kind of tips the hand as to what fight made it. EFCA doesn't really have that. It's kind of a big tent, big umbrella theological statement that would be welcoming to Reformed types and not Reformed types. That, and the tradition is very much focused on the life of the mind. So I felt like I got that academic side of the Christian experience, church history, church fathers, all of that. I got that experience in that environment, as well as your basic evangelical church service, very heavy on Bible.
I am not familiar with the FCA. Is that on the more contemporary side of things, or would that be considered more liturgical, classical Baptist?
No, it's certainly not Baptist. It's born out of Lutheranism.
Oh, okay.
Baptists didn't get along so well. So the EFCA is a Viking church born out of Scandinavia. And when all those Vikings came to the Midwest, Missouri and Minnesota, they kind of realized, the Norwegians and the Swedes realized, oh, we're both from the old Lutheran Free Church that broke away from the Lutheran State Church in the 19th century in the Old World. We should probably make common cause. I think there were some Danes in there as well. And so originally the Evangelical Free Church of America was, it was one of those ethnic churches with services in Swedish, particularly in Swedish. And that was still going on until fairly recently. You had Swedish congregations. I don't know that there are any left at this point.
I've seen that anecdotally, as I do a lot of long haul driving. I did a drive through rural Illinois about 2 months ago, and it struck me just how many Lutheran churches there were, all like on every single corner, like cornfield Lutheran church, cornfield Lutheran church, and then I knew I was in the South immediately when it went turned to cornfield mountain Baptist church. Okay, now I'm in the South. But it's definitely I've observed that kind of cultural ethnic church in especially since I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. I was surrounded by that kind of milieu. Like it was every single non-built-up suburban place was just German farmers, which meant nothing but Lutheran churches. Except my family, surprisingly, I think we were like the one Methodist German family out there. So,
all right, yeah, that Missouri Synod Lutheran, that confessing German Lutheran church, is a big deal in Illinois and Missouri. And you get into a little bit different Lutheran crowd when you get into Wisconsin. There's a Wisconsin Synod. I think that's from a different region of Germany originally, and they're close. They're both what you'd call a confessing church, but they're a little different slice. And the Evangelical Free Church looks and feels a lot different than those more liturgical, confessing German American synods. So it's the point being, man, you cannot get out too fine of brush when you're talking about historical Christianity. I mean, here we are just talking about a place that you and I have both lived in common, and what we've observed living there, driving around there. Here we are just talking about our own histories, and already our mutual stories tell a tale of a religion of a bunch of Jewish people occupied by Roman people that should have nothing to do with Missouri or Wisconsin or Sweden or Minnesota or Northern Illinois, and yet it does. How on earth can that thing, I mean, one of, 30 known Messianic claimants? We're talking about one of those early empire, first century-ish Messianic claimants from Judea. We're talking about one of those guys still. How does something like that rise to the top and go to every corner of the earth? And I know some people in the West are like, oh, Christianity's in trouble. People don't believe. There aren't crosses and advertisements for breakfast cereal anymore. But Christianity is doing great. It's thriving all around the world. People from the third world, or what we used to call the third world, maybe now we call it the developing world, are sending missionaries back to the United States. You can't kill it, because there's something about the narrative that absolutely squares with the human experience and the story of history. And unsurprisingly, if you're going to have a religion that goes absolutely global without one central authority figure who can dictate things even through violence to demand uniformity across the board, if it's going to be culturally and linguistically and historically transcendent, you're going to get a lot of different versions, and those versions, those points of emphasis that you'll get from one to the next, they're going to pop at different times in history when what they are good at, when the pressures that they were forged out of just happen to make them exactly what is needed for this moment in history. They're going to be able to speak words of life and do things that are good. It's just very few of them have been built for every moment in history and everything that comes up. And so we do tend to see this cycle. This isn't a new thing of an expression of Christianity regionally, ethnically, maybe even theologically. It doesn't do much for a while. It really resonates with one specific type of person, and then pow, something happens culturally, and they're the ones who are really able to pick up the slack, pick up the baton, and it works. And then like that experiment with the pigeon, where you put a button in there and the pigeon pushes the one colored button and food comes out, and then you stop making it do that, but the pigeon's already fixated on the button, and it just pushes the button again and again, not getting food. And what we see is these different expressions of Christianity. You're like, but this worked in 1880. We got to keep pushing that button, but the food doesn't come out as much. Well, God bless them. God bless all of us. It's, there's an interesting life cycle and ebb and flow to all of these different groups. And right now, Certain groups are going to be a little more in vogue. Others are going to be out of vogue. And it's not just a stylistic thing. It's a matter of, no, really, certain groups are very well positioned right now to articulate the gospel, the scriptures, the things of God to society in the West right now. Other groups are not as well positioned for that, but might be greatly positioned for whatever happens next. And I, for one, am at peace with that.
I appreciate that as a slightly more optimistic narrative than I hear a lot lately, because I'm surrounded by so many people that essentially believe that the Christian world is just 100% in decline. You know, there was a great point in the past when Christian civilization thrived, and depending on who you ask, that's either 480 or 1280 or 1517 or 1776 or whenever your preferred moment where the city on the hill existed, and everyone was Christian and everyone was happy and everyone was fine, and then all of a sudden something happened and all of a sudden the entire world stopped being Christian, and now everything bad is happening as a result of that. And I was just reading Peter Manisow's book One Nation Under Gods, and he was a little bit more adversarial than I appreciated, but he did do a really good job of kind of articulating that Christians are always in the adversarial role in society at all times, because there's always going to be about 80% of people that are just kind of iffy, just don't care. They're going through life. They'll do whatever they're told to do, and they don't really have any investment. And then there's the 20% of people that have either deeply against religion or they're deeply interested in it. And those are the ones that do most of the investing, and they spend most of the time in church and spend most of the time thinking about these questions. And those are the ones that really make the biggest difference, because even you go back to, you know, the height of Catholic civilization, 90% of the people are just going to mass, and they don't know what most of what they're believing is. Even now, like 70% of Catholics don't understand the Eucharist. They don't understand the depth of their theology. So I like that perspective.
Right now it's screaming at you from a Catholic perspective and saying, we do too understand. Well, right, if you're listening to this and you're a Catholic, you do understand, because you're who Tyler just described as being invested. And in that 20%, I think was the number you threw out.
I mean, that's the Pareto distribution. So generally you're going to get 80%, or 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. So that just kind of as a general rule, and that generally maps onto what you'll see for serious religious people in my estimation. So
I think another reason that adversarial role is always there is because Christians, usually, there are always exceptions, but a close look at the teachings of Matthew and what we see in all four Gospels has man-made institutions as one kingdom and the kingdom of God as the other kingdom. And Jesus is saying, pick this other kingdom. The values are better. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the meek. The values of the kingdom, the one that was promised to David, the one that was hinted at to Abraham, the one that's predicted in Isaiah. That kingdom is good. That kingdom is what everybody actually wants and says that they want. So the Christians in an adversarial role, if they understand that dichotomy, it's not that Christians are mandated to hate or resist government at every turn, but government's world kingdom stuff, and it consistently fails to deliver on its lofty promises made every 2 to 4 years, whereas the kingdom, you don't need any force to make it happen. You don't need anyone to be subjugated. You don't need anybody to be mandated to participate. You can do kingdom value stuff without anyone else if you were the only one left. And so Christians seem to thrive and seem to be operating consistently with Jesus' message when they hold on rather loosely to the world kingdom institutions, the state, and let the state be what it is. It could be useful here and there. It could be of benefit for justice and things like that, like Paul idealizes in Romans 13. But generally speaking, the Christian is this person who walks through history going, I got a different king. Right, but I don't totally live in this world. Yeah, that's cool that you did some paperwork and that's how it is. And I understand I can't stop you from having wars all the time and exploiting people. I'll try, but I do so in the service of a greater king. And that's just it's a very adversarial role to most of what goes on in society, because it's a higher loyalty than to what for most people is the greatest, most powerful, even truth-defining loyalty, which is the state. The state's fine, but the Christian has the theological capacity to shrug at that a little bit more while everybody else panics about it. And that makes Christians weird, historically.
So in your work doing these ecumenical dialogues, what do you tend to take away from these discussions? Because obviously, like you're saying, we have these moments in history where one church can do an incredible work because of the way it orients itself and what it focuses on, but it obviously doesn't work. You know, Billy Graham can bring 20 million people to Christ in the 1970s, but you know it's not doing that same thing in 2022 is not going to work. What do you tend to take away from these dialogues you have, where you'll speak with the Eastern Orthodox or Catholics or Lutherans or Seventh-day Adventists? What do you tend to take away from these discussions?
Oh, so much. A lot of what we've already been talking about, I suppose. I've become more convinced than ever that if I could push a button and make everybody me theologically, that actually wouldn't be good. Yet I think all the things I think for a reason, and obviously I think I'm right about all the things I think, but I know I'm not, which is such a weird way to live, right? I think I'm right, or I would stop thinking the things I think theologically and think the thing that I now believe to be right. But then I would immediately again believe that all the things I think are right. That's the nature of thought. It's the nature of holding theological assertions. So the question then isn't do you hold them, it's how you hold them. And I come away from these conversations feeling like, okay, look, we can't help but believe things about God. We can't help but believe things about what we read in the scriptures. We can't help but come to conclusions. And yet also, any sane read of those same scriptures or sane examination of our own intellectual history as an individual must lead us to the conclusion that we have been wrong about things at every given moment in our intellectual journey. And though we may not know what things we are wrong about now, we are wrong again. I'm wrong right now. I'm 100% sure that my theology is incorrect on some points, or maybe a lot of points. I just don't know which ones. But I think that there's, in so many of the people I've talked to, there really is an intellectual humility that is contagious and that I hope starts to rub off on me more, where most of the people I talk to have some sort of ethic for what if I'm wrong. They have some sort of notion of intellectual grace. And I guess where I would draw the line coming out of all these conversations between fundamentalist and not, one of the key indicators of fundamentalism would be you have no category for what if I'm wrong. You have no category for what do I do with everybody else who's a Christian, who could say the creeds, who's loyal to the scriptures, who lives out Christian charity and lives out the Christian life. If you're content to just say you're irredeemably wrong about these things, the only pathway to rightness is to think all the things I think, and I could not possibly be wrong, okay, I suppose that's what fundamentalism looks like. But what's surprising is how many people I've met who can articulate a very cohesive set of beliefs about what they think, but also have some sort of ethic of what to do with other Christians who do not think those same things. I think we could afford to lean into that, but what I find is I really have to work to tease it out of people, because I sense that they are afraid a tiny bit of the loudest, screechiest, most fundamentalist 10% of their expression of Christianity, and maybe at some point we might want to consider accommodating them a little bit less, and just view it as what you kind of alluded to earlier, that kind of goofball phase we all go through when we discover a new cohesive set of ideas that hang together. we evaluate everything through those lenses, and we can kind of get a little myopic for a little while in that regard. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, in terms of what have I taken from this, I have seen magnificent levels of conviction. I've talked with men and women who are saying, I'm really, really convicted of this. I'm really convinced of this. If I needed to, I'd be prepared to go to the mat and defend and articulate this theological understanding. But also a degree of Christian humility by even meeting with me or acknowledging the validity of who I am and what I do in my tradition, that the gospel could be efficacious in another Christian context as well. That's been fascinating. And my comment section is 98 to people who hold deep convictions, and one of those convictions is, yeah, I could be wrong about things, and the gospel could clearly work through another historical Orthodox Christian tradition than my own. 2% who just simply cannot believe they are right unless everyone else is wrong. And so I get this sense of insecurity from a small minority of Christians who care about theology and think about things, that really their pathway to feeling right about what they believe is to somehow crush every competing theological system or set of beliefs. And then when they're the only one left standing atop the pile of smoldering theological rubble, then and only then will Christianity have truly prevailed, and can they finally rest. But I'm just stunned at the ratio. You would expect, doing what I do, to just run into jerk after jerk, and I don't. I run into people who think things for a good reason, who disagree pretty well, and who are positioned to do things I'm not positioned to do in terms of doing Christian redemptive stuff and reaching people with the gospel. Some of these traditions I go to, I come away thinking, and that's pretty cool. That's cohesive. I see it. I'll be honest. Some of them I go to, you'll notice at the end of my video, I don't say at any point, oh, that was really cohesive. That's a cohesive, internally coherent position if you make these 4 or 5 assumptions, because some of the churches I visited are not internally cohesive. They're in a morph phase. They're responding to societal pressures, and it doesn't make as much sense as some other traditions. I'm not trying to be mean, but I think that's okay. Got a couple of videos that I'm debating whether or not to release right now, where I don't need to say anything. It's not a great look for that tradition, but the people I talk to are kind. So I don't know. I haven't met any jerks at all. I've seen a varying degree of internal cohesiveness, and I've seen far more humility and collegiality than I ever would have expected from a project like this. Does that answer your question, or did I take that in the wrong direction?
No, that's great. I mean, I don't know if it's just the people I foster or the fact that I spend most of my time on Twitter, but I have not. My ratio of aggressive Christian to calmer Christian is much worse than yours, it seems, because my feed is just filled with people who are just like, everyone who doesn't submit to the Russian Orthodox Church is going to hell for all eternity, and I'm just sitting here like, okay, goodness. I meet people like that from all different creeds. I've met Protestants who think that everyone between 400 and 1517 is in hell for all eternity because they follow the heresies of the Catholic Church, which just doesn't sound, that just doesn't sound right. I've also, I also meet plenty of more liturgical people that think that every low church Protestant is immediately in heresy and has their soul is threatened because they're not worshiping correctly, and I'm just like, that doesn't sound right either, because I've seen God working through too many people that are outside these traditions. I wish I had a word for it, but there's I guess I've just been calling it Lewis's idea of mere Christianity, but I don't know what the lowest common denominator for all this is. I don't know at what point are you a Christian tradition that is carrying the Spirit of God and is actually making a difference in the world? even though even if we're all squabbling over predestination and the nature of the sacraments and
I don't think we're
everything.
all squabbling over that.
Well, I mean, depending on how you define them, because if you put a Baptist and a Catholic in the room, and they're gonna gnaw each other, but
I personally know hundreds of Baptists and Catholics who I could put in a room, and they would not do that.
Sure, I'm not saying in all circumstances. I'm just saying it. I mean, I have plenty of hardcore Catholic friends that are they like having the one Protestant around because they like being challenged. But
you serve a purpose.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, I gotta, sometimes you just gotta come in and correct their syncretic heresies. But just from a pure theological perspective, the Baptist view of communion and the Catholic view of union don't cohabitate. They're saying two completely different things, and they serve two completely different purposes. But at the end of the day, the scriptures tell us to take communion because it is what Christ commands. And even if Christ doesn't directly say X is the reason why, what purpose is it serving, and we can reasonably read the scriptures and come to a conclusion, but the fact that people are coming to different conclusions is obviously the problem, at least when it comes to the kind of hostility that it can create. But ideally, we can work beyond a lot of that.
Even on that example, though, if we step back from the fight and just break it down to a necessary view and an expanded view, that's really what you have there. Right? So sometimes if you go taxonomy instead of the personalities and the fight, and you just kind of lower the stakes, Jesus does say what it's for. He says exactly why to do it and what you're doing it for. Do this in remembrance of me. He said, so it's at least that, right? We can say that with certainty. I think everybody would agree.
Yeah.
That at minimum, one function, maybe the entire function, it's the only one he explicitly says, is to remember who Jesus is. I mean, he's the king. The entire document, the entire book surrounding him saying that is advancing the notion that he is the king of this great kingdom and that he's creating a new family of faith, and that, who is my father, or who is my sister, my mother, my brothers? Well, it's those who do the will of my Father. Okay, so we can all agree on that. And if we can't agree on anything else, that's still pretty good between a Baptist and a Catholic to say that at least the baseline function of this is an acknowledgement of Christ as King and doing exactly what he said, which is remember. Now, of course, you know this, but the expanded function is really more of a debate about the role of the church institution in mediating salvation. It's after that, you're really dealing in soteriology. The Baptist would say that salvation is not a result of the table, and the strength of the text, they got a good case. John 6 being the outstanding element, the Catholic will look at that, and it's a more multifaceted view that gets them there, and the text alone isn't how they get there. And so just acknowledging, here's how we arrive at these things and what we're really discussing, I think it takes some of the fangs out of it a little bit, because at the end of the day, both the Catholic and the Baptist are probably going to have a pretty similar view of what we're remembering, and what did Jesus actually do on the cross. Are people sinful? Yep. Do people need redemption? Both groups would say, yep. How is that redemption made possible? Well, it's by the work of Jesus. Like, the church doesn't matter. It's not even a thing. If the cross didn't happen, if the resurrection didn't happen, somehow there is an atonement that occurs there. Might debate the exact language of how that all plays, but both parties would agree on that. So even on that very contentious debate, or the one that can be, still in the grand scheme of all of the religious ideas of all of history, both agree that at least at a minimum level, this points to the justifying salvific work of Christ on the cross. That's a lot of shaded area in the Venn diagram. Maybe I'm just kind of glass half full here, but to me it feels like in baseball, a good pitch on the edge of the zone handled by a sloppy catcher who moves that ball out of the zone lazily makes it appear that what you had there was not a strike but a ball in the eyes of the umpire. just framing that pitch properly at the edge of the strike zone makes that ball appear more to be what it actually was, which is a borderline strike, but it's still a strike. And I feel like in our Christian conversations, we just rush to frame pitches outside of the strike zone again and like maybe because it's fun, and maybe we do that instead of actually going and talking to people about why the kingdom is good and why, whether you are a radical leftist progressive or a wildly fundamentalist conservative, still the stated values and characteristics of the kingdom are what theoretically both groups want. Theoretically, this is what everyone wants that Jesus is spelling out that comes with Jesus' kingdom. But Christianity does not articulate that very much right now. We talk to ourselves a lot right now about why we're mad at each other about things. Like, all right, we're just, what, like that kind of thinking is just like we're punting on the idea that this is supposed to be for all nations anymore. Well, that didn't work out. The votes didn't go our way, whatever. So now we got to find out who gets to win what's left. I just think that's stupid. This is the power of salvation. This is the truth. This is the thing that scratches the itch that every single person feels, regardless of political preference or background. And man, I'd be really interested to see what would happen if the energy we put into bickering with each other in stupid Reddit threads was redirected to go outside your house where sun is, find a person who eats food and has a body, and find a way to invest in a human, content that they might never respond to the message of the kingdom, but with great intentionality to see if they will. When I go and talk with churches, I never put this on camera, or I haven't yet, but I ask almost everybody the same question. When is the last time an adult, educated, non-crisis church outsider just became by who you are as a church and became a Christian at your church? Just give me a name. You know, people would be like, well, there was Louise, she was on meth, and you know, somebody knew her and we helped her kind of get off the meth, and she goes to church now, and that's awesome. Well, there was Don and Carla, and there'd been some cheating, and they were on the verge of divorce, and somebody recommended them to counseling, and like, okay, awesome. But I'm asking something different. When's the last time someone from your church took what had been invested in them in terms of your theological tradition? When is the last time your theological tradition in your church produced fruit such that someone, anyone, in an official capacity or otherwise, went out into the great wide world, pounded pavement, invested in another human, showing them the love and the character of Christ, and that person, through no crisis or meltdown, was like, yeah, I see it, I'm in. And then they started living the Christian life and affecting people. Almost every time I ask that question, the answer is something from the Bush or Reagan administration. It's 35 years ago, it's 40 years ago, people got to go way back. Well, you know, Dave's 16-year-old son got in some trouble, and then he became a Christian at camp. Cool, I'm for that, that's awesome, but that's not the question I'm asking. And the reason I think nobody has answers to those questions that are particularly impressive is simply because this attitude of concession, like, we lost, now let's just fight over theology. I think that's so dumb. We have the most meaningful, powerful, life-giving message for people like us, people not like us. Just go out, be it, and do it. That's so countercultural right now. To be eyes up, to engage with other people like humans, to see value in them, whether they come around to your way of thinking or not. Nobody does that. It's so powerful. And so I'm holding on to these theology fights, though I do care about them. I'm just holding on to them more loosely now, and the people who are impressing me are the people I go and visit with, and they're out pounding pavement and accomplishing things and living out all of these things that so often I just sit around and theorize about. So that's kind of where my head's at.
Yeah, I mean, I can count on one hand the number of times I've run into people in public who were proselytizing who weren't, either Jehovah's Witnesses or, you know, the yellow sign fundamentalists, if you're, you know, those people, is like, you're all going to hell, believe in Jesus, which, you know, they're doing something, but, you know, maybe not the most tactful way to do that. But
and that's not even what I'm describing.
No, exactly. I mean, just you know, being
go be a human.
Yeah, just being a sensible person and reaching out to someone who doesn't know this, but is, you know, isn't in crisis. That's a very different way to approach that. And I don't hear a lot of that. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and I tell you, the people who are doing it the best are the people who aren't like my theological tradition. I have huge reservations about Pentecostalism. We just do not see things the same way on so many points. But I've never asked a Pentecostal that question and had them be like, yeah, we don't really do that. Nope, they always got names. They're always ready right there. And I might have questions or reservations about what happens in the discipleship process after that. I might have questions about what happens in that worship service. But my goodness, is that crowd willing to go out and try right now to befriend people, to invest in people. And that lights such a fire under me because I felt such smugness and superiority theologically to that crowd, and yet look what they do. So that stuff is those kind of realizations, those kind of epiphanies are pretty humbling for me, and I don't know, make of that what you will.
I just a couple weeks ago read G.K. Chesterton's book on Francis of Assisi, and he talks about how in, I believe it was 12th century Italy, there was this kind of spiritual dryness to the world, that things were not advancing in the right way, and that because of Assisi's or Francis's ministry, it brought the church to life in a way that it wasn't alive beforehand. And as you're saying that, I'm drawing the connection to where we are right now, because there's just so much bitterness. I mean, it seems like every church tradition is schisming right now, or threatening to schism. You know, the Methodists are threatening to schism. The Southern Baptist Convention is threatening to fall apart. The Lutherans have already broken. The Episcopal Church is already broken. The Catholic Church is, you know, you've got the Jesuits, and the people are mad at the Jesuits, and all the trads are like, well, the Catholic Church is going to be great as soon as all the Jesuits die off. And it's like, there's, you know, that's such a bitter way to look at things. It's like, we are in such a need for a joyful Christianity to come up, even it doesn't even really matter what denomination. We just need this kind of, we need that spark back of, you know, willingness to go out in the world and actually do the ministering, because we're eating each other right now, and it's so hard to sit through, and it's so disheartening.
I did a video with an Episcopal guy the other day. Good dude, maybe a little wounded, maybe a little defensive. It's a very interesting church. The panels in the church had decisively, or the stained glass windows in the church had decisively communist imagery throughout, about the conflict between the laborer and the capitalist, with kind of Jesus over the top of it, sort of blessing this 1930s understanding of economics and communism. It was strange. I've never seen anything like it. Lots of cool things about the church, lots of cool things about what the guy there had to say. And he was upset and frustrated with the expressions of Anglicanism that had split away. I didn't want to fight him about it, but I'm sitting there thinking, but they should have split away. They don't think what's in your stained glass windows, and that's in your stained glass windows. They don't agree with you on all of these things. Somebody did a mental calculation here and was like, hey, we're going to be more effective to have two things that don't agree than we would be to have one thing that's mired in constant disagreement. I'd say split in that situation. Knock yourselves out. Shrewd as serpents, innocent as doves, right? Matthew 10:16. That's the strategic commissioning. This is the lesser commission, but it's a strategic commissioning from Jesus. Is it more shrewd in some circumstances to stay together on certain issues and just grind through it? Yeah, I could imagine that scenario. Cool. Well, if that's why you're doing it, for the sake of shrewdness as representatives of the kingdom and that this is what most accomplishes Christian unity, and stay together, grind through it. Cool. If you do that work and you're like, no, the shrewd thing to do would be to root for each other from just a slightly greater distance and be theological cousins instead of bickering theological siblings under the same roof, that could be the shrewd move at some point as well. And so I used to be Mr. I don't like all these church splits. Increasingly going, well, but if you're paralyzed by your situation because you lack theological identity or conviction that you can share at all, I don't know, like sometimes negotiating an amenable partnership that creates two institutions might be more effective. You might have, instead of having no group that's positioned to do anything good, now you've got two smaller groups that are at least both positioned to do something. I don't know. I'm not in charge of Christianity. I think it's good that I'm not in charge of Christianity. I'm quite certain I would screw the entire thing up, but I would like to be one little drop in the bucket of trying to be redemptive in all of it. And even if I can't achieve that, being around a ton of people who are trying to be redemptive has had a very positive effect on me, and it's forced me to reevaluate some things about the way I come at it. So I'm grateful for the people who've put time into me that way.
Well, men greater than you and I have found ways to muck up the entire church beyond repair. So the fact that we, sometimes having the humility to say, I just got to do the work of digging out the muck and not figuring out the solutions. There's humility in that. I think that the church as a whole needs that right now. We're about out of time in terms of how much time I have. Do you want to shout out where people can find you and working on social media and YouTube?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for asking. On Twitter, I'm at Matt Whitman, TMDH. YouTube, if you search Matt Whitman, the 10-Minute Bible Hour. I think we're pivoting the name just slightly there because, we're pivoting the name there. So if you search either of those, you'll find my channel with all kinds of Bible, theology, history stuff there. Maybe Tyler can link it. And then my daily podcast is the thing that I do that the most people participate in. We just work straight through books of the Bible, try to do it in a way that's fun and not fairly persuasive to my read on all the things, but just a good, raw, clean read on a book of the Bible at a time. Right now we're working on the book of Matthew. We do it every weekday. That's just called the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast, and you can get that anywhere you find podcasts.
All right. Thank you so much for joining. This ended up being a heavier conversation than I expected it to be, but it was. I appreciate your willingness to kind of go down the rabbit hole on this.
Oh yeah, no, I thought you set it up really well. You handled your business great, Tyler. Thank you.
Thank you very much. God bless.
Take care, man.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cali, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.